The sun hung low over the arid valleys of northern Mexico, casting long, skeletal shadows across the parched earth where the mountains clawed at the sky like ancient sentinels. Here, in the forgotten folds of Sonora, the wind carried more than dust. It carried whispers. Whispers of narcos in black trucks prowling backroads, of missing neighbors, of crops withering under the weight of fear. But on a sun-scorched plot of land, stubborn as the gnarled mesquite trees that dotted it, stood a crumbling adobe farmhouse. Its walls, cracked and bleached by decades of relentless heat, seemed to lean inward, as if holding their breath. Inside, 95-year-old Lupe Valdez shuffled across clay tiles, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, her knotted hands tracing the faded floral patterns of a tablecloth she'd embroidered as a bride. The air smelled of dried chili peppers and loneliness. A framed photo of her late husband, Alejandro, his smile forever frozen in 1962, watched from the wall, his eyes seeming to follow her as she moved. She hadn't left the farm in years, not since the village emptied, not since the world turned quiet. But the quiet had teeth now. 3 days earlier, Lupe had found the first warning. A dead coyote strung up on her fence, its matted fur stiff. With blood, a crude X carved into its side. She'd buried it without tears, her spine straight as the rifle Alejandro kept above the hearth. "Ya viene," her neighbor, Tomas, had muttered the next morning, avoiding her gaze as he dropped off a sack of cornmeal. His hands shook. "They're asking about the land again." She'd pretended not to hear, humming an old corrido as she swept the porch, but that night she dragged Alejandro's rusted toolbox from under the bed. Inside, beneath a tangle of wrenches, lay a revolver, oiled and loaded. By dawn, the trucks came. They idled at the edge of her property, engines growling like starved beasts, their tinted windows reflecting the sunrise in bloody smears. Lupe stood on her porch, squinting into the glare, her flowered apron flapping against her bony knees. A man stepped out, tall, his face obscured by a baseball cap, and tossed a burlap sack onto the dirt. It landed with a thud, spilling glossy green apples across the ground. "Para usted, abuelita," he called, his voice slick as motor oil. "A gift." She said nothing, her jaw set. Apples. A joke. A threat. Her orchard had died years ago, its roots poisoned by drought and disuse. The man lit a cigarette, the ember flaring like a tiny warning signal. "You'll want to sell soon," he said. "The price changes." That night the phone rang. It hadn't rung in years, not since the government cut the lines, leaving her with a relic as useless as the rotary dial itself. Yet there it was, shrill and insistent, shattering the silence. Lupe's heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted the receiver, the cord trembling in her grip. "Bueno?" Static hissed, then a voice, deep, distorted, spat a single sentence, "La tierra o la vida." The line went dead. Land or life. She clutched the receiver until her knuckles whitened, the words echoing in the hollow dark. Outside, the wind moaned through the empty chicken coop, and for the first time in decades, Lupe felt fear, not for herself, but for the ghosts that lingered here. For Alejandro's roses, long since choked by weeds. For the child they'd buried under the oak tree. For the story this land would tell, if she let it die. At dawn, she dragged a wooden chair to the edge of the property, its legs scraping grooves. In the dirt, she sat, the revolver heavy in her lap, and watched the horizon. Let them come, let them see. But as the sun climbed, baking the earth into cracked leather, a different plan unfurled in her mind, one that required a phone call of her own. Her fingers hovered over the dusty rotary dial, each number a landmine. Who could she trust? The police, the priest, the journalist who'd written about the cartels last year, his article buried like a secret? Her breath hitched as she pressed. The first digit, the click echoing like a gunshot. Somewhere a dog howled. Somewhere an engine revved, and in the stillness between heartbeats, Lupe Valdez, 95 years old, tougher than barbed wire and out of options, began to dial. The rotary dial clicked with each turn, the sound sharp and deliberate, like the ticking of a bomb. Lupe's fingers, calloused from decades of tilling soil and mending fences, hesitated over the final number. Her mind raced, torn between the memory of Alejandro's voice, "Nunca te rindas, Lupe," and the cold reality of the men in the trucks. Never give up. But what did that mean now, when the world had turned so cruel? She pressed the last digit and held her breath. The receiver pressed tightly to her ear. The line rang once, twice, then a voice answered, crackling, distant, but unmistakably human. "Ah, ¿quién habla?" Lupe froze. She hadn't expected an answer. For a moment she considered hanging up, retreating into the safety of silence. But then she thought of the coyote on the fence, of the apples spilled like a taunt, of the voice on the phone last night. La tierra o la vida, her land or her life. She straightened her spine, the way Alejandro always had when facing trouble. "This is Lupe Valdez," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I need help." The voice on the other end paused. "From who?" "From anyone who'll listen." The line went silent, and for a moment Lupe thought she'd been disconnected. But then the voice returned, softer now. "Stay where you are. Someone will come." She hung up, her heart pounding. Someone will come, but who? And when? The farmhouse felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the shadows stretching longer. She glanced at Alejandro's photo, his smile unchanged, his eyes still watching. "What would you do, viejo?" she whispered. But she already knew he'd fight. He'd always fought, for her, for the land, for the life they'd built together. The next morning, Tomas returned, his face pale beneath the brim of his straw hat. He carried a basket of tortillas and a jar of honey, his hands shaking as he set them on the table. "They came to my house last night," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They asked about you." Lupe poured him a cup of bitter coffee, her hands steady despite the knot in her stomach. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing," Tomas said quickly, his eyes darting to the window. "But they know you're alone. They know you're old," she snorted, a sound that was half laugh, half defiance. "Old doesn't mean weak." Tomas didn't smile. "Lupe, these men, they don't care about strength. They care about fear, and they'll do whatever it takes to make you afraid." She sipped her coffee, the bitterness grounding her. "I've buried a husband, a child, and more friends than I can count. Fear doesn't scare me anymore." Tomas leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Then think about the land. Alejandro loved this place. He'd want you to protect it." Lupe's chest tightened. The land. It wasn't just dirt and rocks. It was their story. She remembered the day they'd bought it, Alejandro's hands rough but gentle as he'd clasped hers. "This is ours," he'd said, his voice thick with pride. "Our legacy." She'd believed him then, but now, with the cartel circling, like vultures, she wondered if legacy was just another word for burden. By midday, the heat was unbearable, the air thick with the scent of dry grass and desperation. Lupe sat on the porch, her revolver within reach, and watched the horizon. She thought about the phone call, about the voice that had promised help. Who had she reached? A journalist? A government official? Or just another pawn in the cartels? Game? She didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. As the sun dipped lower, a figure appeared on the road, a woman, her silhouette sharp against the fading light. She walked with purpose, her boots kicking up dust, a satchel slung over her shoulder. Lupe squinted, her hand drifting toward the revolver. But as the woman drew closer, Lupe saw her face, young, determined, with eyes that mirrored her own defiance. "Senora Valdez!" the woman called, stopping at the edge of the property. Lupe stood, her grip tightening on the revolver. "Who's asking?" The woman raised her hands, a gesture of peace. "My name is Marisol. I'm a reporter. You called for help." Lupe studied her, searching for lies. But there was something in Marisol's eyes, a fire, a hunger that reminded her of Alejandro. "Why should I trust you?" Marisol lowered her hands, her voice steady. "Because I've been writing about the cartels for years. Because I've seen what they do to people like you. And because I'm tired of watching them win." Lupe hesitated, then nodded toward the porch. "Sit." Marisol climbed the steps, her movements deliberate, and took a seat on the weathered bench. She pulled a notebook from her satchel, her fingers stained with ink. "Tell me everything," she said, and so Lupe did. She spoke of the coyote on the fence, the apples, the voice on the phone. She spoke of Alejandro, of the child they'd lost, of the life they'd built, and the life they'd lost. She spoke until her voice cracked, until the shadows swallowed the sun, until the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Marisol listened, her pen scratching across the page, her face unreadable. When Lupe finished, she closed her notebook and leaned forward. "We'll fight them," she said. "But it won't be easy, and it won't be safe." Lupe met her gaze, her jaw set. "I didn't ask for easy, I asked for help." That night, as Lupe lay in bed, the revolver on the nightstand, she thought about Marisol's words. "We'll fight them." But how? The cartel was a hydra, its heads multiplying with every blow. And she was just one old woman, her body frail, her time running out. The phone rang again. Lupe's heart leapt into her throat as she reached for the receiver. "Bueno?" This time the voice was different, softer, almost familiar. "Abuelita," it said, sending a chill down her spine. "You shouldn't have called for help." The line went dead. Lupe sat in the dark, the receiver clutched in her hand, her mind racing. How did they know? Who had betrayed her? Tomas? Marisol? Or was it someone else, someone she hadn't even considered? Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the scent of rain, or maybe blood. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound sharp and urgent. Lupe rose from the bed, her bones creaking, and walked to the window. The moon hung low, its light casting long shadows across the yard, and there at the edge of the property stood a figure, silent, watching, waiting. She reached for the revolver, her fingers curling around the cold metal. Let them come, she thought. Let them see what an old woman can do. But as the figure stepped into the light, Lupe's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a man. It was a child. The child stood motionless at the edge of the property, their small frame silhouetted against the pale glow of the moon. Lupe squinted, her grip tightening on the revolver, but the figure didn't move. It was a girl, no older than 10, her hair tangled and her dress torn. She looked like a ghost, her eyes wide and unblinking, her face smudged with dirt. Lupe's heart ached, a sharp pang of memory cutting through her fear. She thought of her own daughter, Rosa, who had died so young, her laughter forever silenced by fever. The girl outside reminded her of Rosa, not in her features, but in her stillness, her fragility. Lupe lowered the revolver, her hands trembling. "Key, this is a key, Nina," she called, her voice cracking. "What are you doing here?" The girl didn't answer. She simply stared, her gaze piercing through the darkness, as if she could see into Lupe's soul. Then, without a word, she turned and disappeared into the night, her bare feet silent on the dry earth. Lupe stood at the window for a long time, her mind racing. Was the girl real, or was she a trick, a figment of exhaustion and fear? She thought of the phone call, the voice that had warned her not to seek help. Was this their doing, a warning, a threat? She didn't know, but the sight of the child had shaken her to her core. The next morning, Marisol returned, her face grim. She carried a stack of newspapers under one arm, their headlines screaming violence and corruption. "They're escalating," she said, dropping the papers onto the table. "More disappearances, more threats. They're trying to scare people into silence." Lupe poured her a cup of coffee, her hands steadier now. "They've already tried scaring me. It didn't work." Marisol glanced at the revolver on the table, her expression unreadable. "You're brave, Senora. But bravery isn't always enough." Lupe sat across from her, her eyes narrowing. "What are you saying?" Marisol leaned forward, her voice low. "I've been digging into the cartel's operations. They're not just after your land. They're after something else, something buried here." Lupe frowned. "Buried? What are you talking about?" Marisol hesitated, then pulled a map from her satchel. It was old, its edges frayed, the ink faded but still legible. She spread it across the table, her finger tracing a line that ran through Lupe's property. "This is an old smuggling route," she said, "used by bandits and revolutionaries. Decades ago. The cartel thinks there's something valuable hidden here, gold, weapons, something. That's why they want your land. That's why they won't stop." Lupe stared at the map, her mind reeling. She thought of Alejandro, of the stories he'd told about the bandits who'd once roamed these hills. He'd always dismissed them as tall tales, but now she wondered, had he known? Had he kept it from her? "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice tight. Marisol met her gaze, her eyes fierce. "Because if we can find it first, we can use it against them, we can expose them, but it won't be easy. And it won't be safe." Lupe's chest tightened. She thought of the girl in the night, of the voice on the phone, of the men in the trucks. She thought of Alejandro, of the life they'd built, of the legacy they'd fought so hard to protect. And she thought of Rosa, her laughter echoing in her mind, her voice whispering, "Nunca te rindas, mamá. Never give up. Tell me what to do," Lupe said, her voice steady. That afternoon, they began their search. Marisol led the way, her movements quick and deliberate, while Lupe followed, her steps slow but determined. They combed the property, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign of disturbance. The sun beat down on them, the heat relentless, but Lupe didn't complain. She focused on the task, her mind sharp, her resolve unshakable. As they worked, Marisol asked questions. About Alejandro, about the farm, about the stories he'd told. Lupe answered as best she could, her voice tinged with nostalgia. She spoke of the day they'd planted the orchard, of the nights they'd spent dancing under the stars, of the child they'd buried beneath the oak tree. "You've lived a hard life," Marisol said softly. Lupe nodded, her eyes distant. "But a good one. Alejandro made sure of that." Marisol hesitated, then asked, "Do you think he knew about the smuggling route?" Lupe's chest tightened. She thought of Alejandro, of the way he'd always protected her, always shielded her from the worst of the world. Had he known? Had he kept it from her to keep her safe? She didn't know, but the thought gnawed at her. As the sun began to set, they found it, a patch of earth that looked different from the rest, the soil looser, the grass thinner. Marisol knelt, her fingers digging into the dirt, and pulled out a rusted metal box. It was small, its surface pitted with age, but it was unmistakably man-made. Lupe's breath caught in her throat. "What is it?" Marisol pried it open, her hands trembling. Inside was a stack of papers, yellowed and brittle, and a single photograph. She held it up to the fading light, her eyes widening. The photo was of a group of men, their faces stern, their hands resting on rifles. Among them was a young Alejandro, his smile faint but unmistakable. Lupe's heart stopped. She reached for the photo, her fingers brushing against the image of her husband. What is this?" Marisol's voice was barely a whisper. "I think your husband was part of something bigger than you realized." Before Lupe could respond, the sound of an engine cut through the silence. They turned, their eyes scanning the horizon, and saw it. A black truck, its windows tinted, its engine growling as it sped toward them. Marisol grabbed the box, her voice urgent. "We need to go, now!" Lupe hesitated, her eyes locked on the truck. She thought of the girl in the night, of the voice on the phone, of the men who'd threatened her. She thought of Alejandro, of the life they'd built, of the secrets he'd kept. And she thought of Rosa, her laughter echoing in her mind, her voice whispering, "Nunca te rindas, mamá, never give up." She turned to Marisol, her jaw set. "No, I'm done running." The truck skidded to a halt, its doors flying open. 3 men stepped out, their faces obscured by masks, their hands gripping weapons. They moved with purpose, their eyes locked on Lupe and Marisol. One of them stepped forward, his voice cold. "Give us the box." Lupe stood her ground, her revolver in her hand, her eyes blazing. "This is my land, my home. You don't get to take it." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're just an old woman. What are you going to do?" Lupe's finger tightened on the trigger. "I'm going to fight." The man raised his weapon, his eyes narrowing. "Then you'll die." Before he could pull the trigger, a shot rang out, not from Lupe's revolver, but from somewhere behind her. The man dropped to the ground, his weapon clattering from his hands. Lupe turned, her heart pounding, and saw her. The girl from the night before stood at the edge of the property, a rifle in her hands, her face calm but determined. She lowered the weapon, her eyes meeting Lupe's, and nodded. "I told you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You shouldn't have called for help." And then she was gone, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as she'd appeared. Lupe stood frozen, her mind reeling. Who was the girl? Why had she helped them? And what did she mean by her warning? The sound of engines roared in the distance. More trucks approaching, their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Marisol grabbed Lupe's arm, her voice urgent. "We need to go. Now!" Lupe hesitated, her eyes scanning the horizon. She thought of Alejandro, of the secrets he'd kept, of the life they'd built. She thought of Rosa, her laughter echoing in her mind, her voice whispering, "Nunca te rindas, mamá." Never give up. She turned to Marisol, her jaw set. "No, I'm done running." And as the trucks closed in, Lupe Valdez, 95 years old, tougher than barbed wire and out of options, raised her revolver and prepared to fight.